This is Play-by-Playcast,
Is that faster than a Greyhound?
the podcast about play-by-play guys, for play-by-play guys, by, I'm told, a play-by-play guy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now here's the host of Play-by-Playcast, Tom Bodett. Wait, the Motel 6 guy?
We'll leave the light on for you.
No, Joel Godet.
Joe Godet.
Joel
Joel?
with an L.
Okay, here's your host, Joel Godet.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
It is episode 53 of Play-by-Playcast. It is the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters. Of course, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster. My name is Joel Godet. Thanks as always for clicking subscribe or download and joining us here again on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts, for interacting with us on Twitter as well. For all of you that have done that over the last couple of weeks, much appreciated. You can find the podcast at PXPcast, or you can find myself at Joel Godet, JoelGodett. I actually misspelled my name on last week's episode of the podcast, and then just edited that out because it was mildly embarrassing. But those are the Twitter handles, at PXPcast and at Joel Godet, if you'd like to interact with the show. And then as always, if you have a couple of seconds, throw us a rating or a review. It helps. You know, I always say it helps, and I think it does help. Like the algorithms and all that stuff, like it does make the podcast easier for people to find. But at the end of the day, like it really just helps make me feel better about myself because people like are listening and throwing stars our way. So like from a solely selfish self-esteem standpoint, if you have a couple of seconds and want to throw a star or a rating or a review our way, feel free to go ahead and do that. It would be greatly appreciated. That being said, fun fact about episode 53 of Play-by-Playcast. We've had the open for this podcast now 53 times, a full year plus of Play-by-Playcasts with that open where we have the Tom Bodett, Joel Godet. They sound the same, but sort of kind of not really joke. And of course, Tom Bodett is the We'll Leave the Light On guy for Motel 6. I've recorded many of these podcasts on the road, such as life being a broadcaster, from various different hotels. However, episode 53 is the very first time that Tom Bodett joke has ever been made on a podcast recorded at the Motel 6. We are in Moab, Utah for the podcast here this week. Not for any broadcast purpose. Vacation for me this week. And of course, instead of just recording this podcast before I went on vacation, I thought I would hold near and dear to the authenticity of it and record it the night before we put it out, or the day we put it out, because it's been a fun week. And this past day, Thursday, was stupid busy. So I'm actually recording the pod at 1 a.m. Mountain Time Friday to put it out here on Friday morning. Woke up, watched the sunrise over what's called Dead Horse Point, then hiked for 5 hours, then took a boat ride around the Colorado River, then took an hour just to get off my feet, then did another hike, which is supposed to take 4 hours. I did it in an hour and 40 minutes. I was exhausted. I don't think I should try that again. Followed that up with a little burrito action, and then did some stargazing for what amounted to 3 hours under just truly beautiful pitch black skies. All right, anyway, all of that in the rearview mirror. Episode 53. Our guest is the voice of the Los Angeles Clippers, Brian Sieman, who began his career in a little bit of a different way in some respects. I think a lot of you will find it familiar. And Brian and I talk about this. You look at the way people climb the ranks in minor league baseball to get to a major league job. You start at whatever level, and then you try to get to the next level, and you try to get to AA, and then you try to get to AAA, and then hopefully you can crack it to the major league level. A lot of people don't think about basketball that way, or football that way. Hockey certainly works that way. But there are not a lot of people that are like, God, if I can just get an American Indoor Football League job, I can eventually parlay that into an NFL gig. Just like similarly, or so I thought, there were not a lot of people that would say, hey, if I could get into, the ABA, the new ABA, or the CBA, that could eventually get me to an NBA gig. I was wrong, because not only was there at least one person out there that thought that way, he did it successfully. And that guy is Brian Sieman. Because when he got into this business, he kind of took the minor league route. He took the minor league route through basketball, which eventually led him to the Minnesota Lynx and the Minnesota Timberwolves, and now being the voice of the Los Angeles Clippers. So we talk about that route for Brian Sieman in his career. We talk about his time a little bit at Kansas. We talk about some different intricacies of how he broadcasts, what his prep is like, what it's like being a solo voice in the NBA, and then also some different interviewing skills and tactics depending on the different kinds of guys he's talking to, and also how he handles being in the spotlight of being a team broadcaster in one of the top 2 media markets in this country, in Los Angeles. Fantastic conversation, and I say that a lot, but when I got off the phone with Brian, I was really happy with this conversation for a lot of reasons, and I hope that shines through, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well. Brian Sieman is the voice of the Los Angeles Clippers, and he is guest on, I don't want to say number 53. We've had two-parters, so I'm bad at math. Guest 50? Is he guest 50? Guest 49? He's the guest on episode 53 of Play-by-Playcast.
I had 2 great years in the IBA, and then I had a half a season in the CBA before the entire league folded. But, it's funny you bring up minor league baseball, because I looked at those guys climbing the ladder that way, and that's kind of how I formed my blueprint was, okay, I'm going to do the minor league route as well. I'll get to the CBA. At the time it was, or I was hoping to get to the CBA, I should say. At the time it was owned partially by the NBA, and I thought if I could get to that level, if I were to contact an NBA team, they would definitely know where I was, and they would know that I was a legitimate play-by-play guy. That was always my belief. So the first 2 years in the IBA were awesome. Now you mentioned it's not structured like that. There's no feeder teams. There were teams that would literally have, in a 32-game season, they would have, because they would just keep changing players out, 50 players throughout the year. I mean, it was crazy. We got a $10 a day per diem. It was a bus league. So picture, the northern part of the United States. We're going from Des Moines was the southernmost city in it. So that's middle of Iowa. You're going to Winnipeg, Canada, Saskatoon. If these were bus rides, 12-hour Fargo, North Dakota, South Dakota. We got to see some pretty neat stuff. But what I learned at that point was, I'm not going to climb the ladder because of my tape. It might be good. It's a subjective business. So somebody in, Milwaukee for the Bucks would say this guy's not very good, and somebody in Minnesota might say, hey, we like this guy. So it was subjective. But to climb the ladder for me, to get to that next level, which to me was the CBA, wasn't about the tape. It was about what else I could do. So I learned how to sell. I learned how to do public relations, community relations. I spoke at Kiwanis Club meetings, Rotary Club meetings. I didn't like doing it, but I felt like if I had that on my resume, that I could get to that next level. And truth be told, I really believe that's why I was hired in the CBA. Forget whatever talent I may or may have had at that moment in time. It was because I could do everything else. And the CBA was kind of my leaping platform, so to speak, that I was able to get to where I wanted to be after that.
What of that has come in most handy after the fact now when you think about it?
You know what? To me, it's for me with the Clippers now, like I want to be a part of the whole organization. So technically, I'm only paid to do the games, and that's fine. And there are a lot of people in the NBA that's all they do, and that's it. They're good. For me, like I want to be in with the organization. So when the sales department needs a guy to voice over a potential radio spot, when the community relations team needs somebody to host an event, when digital needs me to fill in something, because I had that background of wearing multiple hats, I feel like when they ask me to do it, I'm truly honored to do it. And so I think a lot of people would bristle at that. Maybe not a lot, but some of them would be like, well, I'm only here to do a play-by-play job. If you want me, you've got to pay me. I don't have that attitude. I just want to be as deeply rooted with the organization as possible.
How about the minor league aspect of what you did in those leagues as well? I remember reading the Paul Shirley book a couple of years ago, the Can I Keep My Jersey? Did you have any Can I Keep My Jersey-esque moments in the CBA and the IBA?
I read that book, but it's so long ago. Paul Shirley, I think his last go around in the NBA was my first year. He was in the training camp with the Timberwolves.
Oh, wow.
And I was fascinated just by him and his ability to kind of whatever the opposite of taking yourself seriously is, that's what he was. He was maybe too far on the opposite end of the spectrum.
Possibly.
He was a blogger at the time. Twitter really wasn't where it is now. So he was blogging, and a lot of the stuff was hilarious and clearly well written. So we would go to certain arenas and there would be more people cheering for Paul Shirley. Now, we weren't going to NBA arenas than they were for Kevin Garnett. It was crazy because he had such a following. I think at the time he was writing for ESPN. I remember reading that book, but I can't recall any of it. But, the minor leagues, there's always some kind of story going on. It was fun. It was crazy. It's just a bizarre situation. And I'm so proud of those years. When I was in the CBA, I mentioned it was only half a year. I showed up in August of 2000, and 2 weeks later, paychecks came and everybody celebrated. And I thought that was weird. I thought that was a bizarre thing to go down. And I'm like, it's payday. Okay, great. Well, I found out 2 weeks later that they don't always come on time. And then when they do, they're not always full of what they should be of in terms of your full stipend. So I was like, oh, okay. So I actually worked about 2 months for free. Didn't get a paycheck in the year 2001. So I worked January, February. The league folded in the first week of February. And I never saw that money again because Isaiah Thomas at the time was owning the team. He became insolvent, and it was just kind of a crazy deal. But those are my minor league stories. There's several others that are more kind of a happier note, but those are the ones that stand out that are kind of, in hindsight, for sure, are a lot more fun.
What are you thinking when, you've laid out this plan that I want to get to the CBA in an effort to help get me to the NBA, and when you finally get to the CBA, it folds. What are you thinking as far as where you go from here?
So I felt like a little bit of buzzard's luck, but at the same time, I don't know if I would encourage this for everybody, but whenever I got a job early in my career, my thoughts were, what's next? Where am I going next? How am I going to get there? I smelled the roses, so to speak. I stopped and smelled the flowers, so to speak, but I kept my mind where am I headed next? So as I mentioned, the CBA at the time had a working relationship with the NBA. One of the first things I did, and so by that, we had all of the media guides and the Blue Book, which has every media member, in every market's email address, telephone number. And at the time, it was probably more popular to send a regular piece of mail, like a letter through the mail. That's how old I am. So what I did was I took all of those media guides home and I wrote every radio and television announcer. And then I had the address for all the directors of broadcasting because I wanted to see how good my tape would be. I wanted it to be the best it could be before I presented it to an NBA guy. So when the league folded, I'd already done the work that I felt like I needed to do to get to that next level. I had created correspondence with probably 30 NBA guys, both radio and TV, have been given terrific advice, one of which was get to the WNBA as fast as you can. And that's what happened the following summer. So I was bummed out for sure that I wasn't going to be calling any games. The atmosphere that I was working in was without a doubt the worst I've ever been in. It was just not a fun place to go. So it was kind of a bittersweet situation, but I felt like I gained what I needed to gain, and that was contacts in the NBA and a tape with the CBA kind of game in the background.
What was the get to the WNBA as quickly as possible? I guess the league is what at that point, 4 years old, if that?
Yeah, so 2, maybe 3 years old, okay. Tops. Yeah, it was a young. No, you're right. You're right, because it started in '97, June of '97.
So what's the methodology on? Hey, this WNBA thing could be a foray for broadcasters to crack into the NBA.
Yeah, so that I wondered the same thing when it was told to me. And it was great advice. It was probably the best advice that was ever given. It was a guy named Mike Inglis. He's currently the radio voice of the Miami Heat. We've crossed paths literally hundreds of times since then. And I bring it up to him every time. I'm like, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So his thought was, get to the WNBA. That way you, number one, be hired by an NBA team, because at that point in time, I think there were 10 teams. All of them were owned and operated by an NBA club. You played in NBA arenas, you traveled NBA-like style. But more importantly, you were hired by an NBA broadcasting director, and then you're going to be working in an NBA market. He's like, get there as fast as you can. And it just, as it always is, the common denominator for everybody in our business that's at where they want to be is luck. And so I happened to run into a friend of a friend that said, hey, I heard this guy was leaving in Minnesota. And I'm like, okay. So I went to, and one of the first times I ever Googled somebody, this is in the year 2001, I Googled this guy, and it turned out he was the radio guy for the Minnesota Lynx. And now he was leaving. And I called them up the same day that basically it was official. And I remember their reaction was like, really? You're interested? And I'm like, I'm very interested in this job. I just got done with the CBA. And they're like, well, we're literally months away from even doing anything, but stay in touch and we'll get to you. And, at the end of the day, it was really great. I remember getting the job in mid-April of 2002, biggest break of my career. And it was the WNBA. I mentioned how much I love the minor leagues. The WNBA was absolutely one of the biggest treats of my life. They were so awesome to deal with and be around. And I'm positive I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the WNBA.
Why is that? What made it a great place to be for, was it 6 years?
From 02 to 07. So I think that's 6 seasons that I did it. Well, first thing, the travel is challenging. You're traveling at like 4:30 in the morning. So you played in, say we were in Minnesota, we'd fly to Indianapolis, and then we'd play that night, stay over. But the way that per diem works, and this is how all teams are in the minor leagues and the WNBA, at least at the time, I think if you stay past 11 o'clock in the city, that they have to give you an extra per diem, like an extra chunk of the per diem. So all flights where you were out by 4:30, 5:30 in the morning. So that was the only downside. Everything else was just, I was euphoric when I would go back to because I was living in Denver with my wife before we got married, and I would travel to Minnesota for the summer. And the ladies were just awesome. They were just, number one, they're super talented. And the game is a lot of fun to watch. You have to get invested in it. Once you are, you're going to be hooked. But there wasn't a player that was off limits to talk to. Like sometimes you have that in the NBA, that there's grizzly guys and they're not going to do any pregame talk, and then postgame they can be a bit snarly. None of that. Coaches, I would go out with them to dinner after the games. We'd all travel. So there's only 18 of us on the travel flight, and we'd all get to know each other. It really felt like a college atmosphere in all the great ways. And I miss it. I actually miss it. When I came out to LA, I didn't get to have the opportunity to do it, and I missed it. But like I said, you're hired by an NBA director in an NBA market by an NBA team. And so what happened in the summer of 02, I did my first year. And then just a few months later, a scheduling conflict for the radio play-by-play guy. And boom, they called me up and they said, can you be in Los Angeles for a game on March 7th for the Lakers and Timberwolves? And I think
I can make it.
I don't know if I ever remember being that crazed before. Like, think about a kid on Christmas. Like, they get all the toys. They multiply that by 1,000. I went bananas, and I was so excited. And I thankfully had a few days to calm down before I called the game. But that was a great day. And in that moment, there was it. I had an NBA tape. And I kept thinking to myself, no matter what happens from here on out, now, you might not ever call another game. You did one game for the rest of your life. You'll have that. No one can ever take it away. Thankfully, I've been able to call several more, but that day always stands out, and it's special. Staples Center was the first game I ever did, 14 years ago, and that's my office, and I go in there every day, and I think about that every time I go in there.
What was that first game like? And what was your approach in terms of the savoring the moment, or the don't mess this up, Brian, or how did you kind of approach that, and what was your mental state?
Well, it's funny. I'll get to the mental state where I was, which I was shockingly surprised at where I was. But how I like to play golf, and I used to listen to the sports psychologists talk about their golfers that they would be coaching or whatever, and they'd always say, don't look at it as a big moment. Look at it as the next shot. You don't want a shot on the driving range to feel any different than the shot on 18 on a Sunday in a major. Everything emotionally wants to be the same. Instead of that, like right thinking, I'm thinking, this is the biggest moment of your life. If you screw this game up, you will never do. I mean, that's how stupid I am. I'm just like, I don't know if I wanted to be able to thrive in the pressure and say that I did it and know that I felt that way. It was a bad approach, but it's funny as the game got on, as the game, as we approached leaving the hotel, I was eerily calm, like to the point where, and I had done a few years in the minor leagues, and I had done Drake football, and I had done a season of WNBA. So I kind of knew the producer that I was going to be working with, to be honest. And I'm not a very overconfident person, but I felt at this time, I was like, this is it. You're ready. You're going to crush it. And I felt at the time it was the best game that I could do at that point in time. The prep was challenging. It's hard to pick up a team that's, 3/4 of the way through the season. So I did a lot of stuff of researching the analyst, who is Jim Peterson. He's now the TV analyst for the Minnesota Timberwolves, and I think is the best in the game. So it was easy to work with him. He made it a lot of fun. But I just called the game the way that I wanted it to be called, knowing that this might be it. Do it your way. Do it the way you feel good about it. And it went really well, so much so that a few weeks later they called me again, and I actually got to go on a 4-game road trip with them and do all the games on radio. So 2002, 2003 was as special of a year for me, just from a professional standpoint, as it ever could be. I mean, it was so fun to do those games, and I realized that, yes, this is the lifestyle that I would like to live, and I was hopeful to be able to get there one day.
You go on to become the voice of the Timberwolves, I know, in 2006, and then you became, obviously, the voice of the Clippers, where you're at now. What is it like being a radio voice in Los Angeles and having the spotlight of that size market and that size magnifying glass on you every time you put a headset on?
It can be daunting if you think about it. And then I think about it in another way. I go to myself, no matter how good I'm going to be, let's say I surpass any expectations of my own expectations by 1,000%. I will never be one of the top 5 voices in this city. When you think about Chick Hearn, Vince Scully, Bob Miller, Ralph Lawler, the list goes on. You'll never be better than those guys. So that it's either kind of it makes you feel upset, or it just kind of gives you kind of a house money. You know what I mean? Like, you can do whatever you want, no matter what. I never think about, being in LA. I think about, because I think it's more global now on radio, with Sirius XM and the internet. We get tweets from Australia. I mean, it's pretty crazy. So I try to talk to everybody, not just in LA. It doesn't bother me. I know, like we have a great radio station. We're on iHeart here. AM 570 is our flagship, huge signal. So it covers all over LA. And I get really fired up. If you told me that there are going to be 10 million people listening, it doesn't make me nervous. It makes me excited. Like, I'm even more motivated, if that's possible, because I'm always really excited to do the games, whether it's a preseason game in October or, as we've been lucky to call the last few years, some really fun playoff ball games. So being in LA, to me, it's no different than it was when I was in Minnesota. I don't see any of the people that I'm talking to. I just assume that, I'd like to assume anyway, that there's a lot of people listening. I don't know if the numbers would always suggest that, but it doesn't bother me. If you told me one person is listening, I'm still fired up, and I'm going to let that person know everything they need to know about this game and these teams and these players.
I saw a quote from you that said, my style's a little different because my personality is a little different. What does that mean to you, and how does your personality, and how do you let your personality flow into what you do on the air?
I think, and you probably have overcome this already with you, but I think finding your personality on the air is the number one thing and the hardest thing to do. And, I look at we'll use the radio guys, the other 30 guys in the NBA. All of them are fantastic. All of them are great. I think the NBA and the place where they are with play-by-play guys, especially on radio, is solid. And what separates us is our personality. So what's a personality on air? Well, it's obviously, how you have fun or what you think is important. That's what I think it gets down to. So there's other announcers that really hit the stats hard because that's what they love. That's what they grew up liking about the NBA or sports. There are others that, just want to be themselves and be kind of a character on the air. That's great. To me, I want to be just who I am. Sometimes I want to have fun, self-deprecating, but at the end of the day, I want to entertain, I want to inform, and I want to make sure people understand what's happening. So I take myself very seriously when I prep. Like, I want to know everything, but as soon as I get on the air, I'm not taking myself serious. I'm trying to have fun. If I make a mistake, man, I'm going to let you know that I'm an idiot. If I have an interesting story, I'm going to say, hey, look, I'm going to tell it a couple of times because I think it's worth repeating. My personality is different than your personality, but that doesn't mean that, this guy A is better than this guy B because their personalities are different. To me, it's all about what you view as important and who you are as a person. Like I said, I'm pretty self-deprecating. I've got a lot of material in that regard. So I like to have fun with it that way. And I take myself very seriously when I'm prepping for a game, and I like to prep. It's a good process, but as soon as I hit the air, all bets are off. We'll have fun with everything. And sometimes you don't use any of the numbers, and you know this, you don't use any of the stats because either the game is good or there's a separate storyline, or you're having fun with, in our case, a host, as opposed to we don't have an analyst on radio, that we're just having a good time together. So if I feel like if I'm having fun, then the people that are listening, I think, would have fun. I think because they know where I'm coming from, in the sense of they know that I'm not there to screw around. They know that I'm trying to help them out, understand what's going on. But if I can have a laugh, I think they can too.
This is probably a horrible audio question, but I'll try it. What does your prep look like? What's your chart look like? How do you organize things so that you know where they are, that they're easily, readily available and findable, and that there's never a moment where you're like, I know I put this down, but where did I put it?
This is the funny, these are like fingerprints. Everyone's is different.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really funny. I've seen people that have, they use those manila folders that kind of, you put in filing cabinets.
Yep.
And they'll just have like, words that go around the corner and sentences that go around, just like in circles. And they're just like, they look like giant chicken scratches. But if you were to listen to them on the air, that these guys have their stuff together. It's pretty funny that way. For me, I needed to be more organized. And for years I did it by hand, and it became very kind of unsettling when I would think about 4 games in 5 nights. I mean, just filling out the board itself took a half hour. That's before I did any stat work. That's just numbers, school, height, weight, all that kind of stuff. But, for me, everything is in columns. So I have 2 columns on my page, and then they're, by the numbers, and then the basic stuff that I have. Like, I literally wouldn't function properly if I didn't have their season stats, the last game that they played, and then the last game they played against, for this example, the Clippers. That's 10% of my work, but it takes a little while to get there. But I love trends. So I'll look at not only every game that a player has played, but sometimes every game they've ever played. I like to see what their trend is, what's going on. And I've not been able to figure out, to be honest with you, am I trying to tell you the future, or am I trying to identify a storyline? I've never been able to figure out what my motivation there is, other than I just want to know it. And if I want to know it, I feel like somebody else would want to know it. So I look a lot of stat work, and that probably takes up 70% of the prep. But the reality is I'll take one good story over 10 great stats any day. So you get those stories by talking to the players, over the course of the year. I certainly do a lot of just basically blank searches online, looking for interviews for players, YouTube interviews, pre-draft interviews, anything that you can get from like, hey, how did you develop your free throw shot? And I'm making the story up. But, I used to love my mom's sweet potato pie, but she wouldn't let me eat it until I had 1,000 free throws made for the day. That kind of stuff, is just gold in my book. So I organize all that. It's color coded. So I know what is a season stat. I know what is a quote unquote nugget. I know what the last game is against us, what the last game they played was, period. And it's fairly well organized. I wouldn't say, my wife would likely agree, I'm not the most organized person in real life, but on my boards, I know where everything is. But to be honest with you, I think once you write it down, or at least in this case, you type it in, it kind of is committed to memory. I'm sure you've had that same experience yourself. Once you do it, you know it, and you're just there for a reference. And it's almost like taking a test before a game. I just review it, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember all that stuff. And it comes out, because you never know when you're going to use it, as you know, with all the years you've done this. So it just, as long as you have it there, it's good.
When it comes to drawing stories out of guys, what's your approach in terms of that, especially because your time can be so limited with them. And I mean, I don't know how certain guys work, but like if you've got a guy like Blake Griffin, maybe it is. It's probably hard to get one-on-one time with a guy like that. And if it is, I would imagine it's limited. I could be wrong. But what's it like to develop kind of relationships and rapport, but also be efficient with your time to get ultimately what you need to know to stay on the air?
That's a great question, because some players, so we'll use Blake and we'll use Chris as one example, and I'll give you a couple of. Blake and Chris are very guarded. Good people, but they're very guarded. And so for me to kind of, I don't do anything deliberate other than like I show up to every shoot around. So they see me every shoot around. I don't always ask them questions. I'm just there. So they know, and Blake's been here since, literally the day he was drafted. So he knows what I'm about. I'm not there trying to tweet out a story or do something crazy. So if I needed to get one-on-one time with Blake once or twice a year, it would happen. But the problem with those guys is that they sometimes can talk in cliches, and there's not really a way around it. The best way around that is no microphone, none. That's the best advice I could give somebody. It was given to me when I first started. I'd interview players and it'd be, it'd be every cliche in the book. You never know on any given day, blah, blah, blah. I took away the mic, and then all of a sudden you start getting like the real story. So if you just went up to talk to some of those guys, the ice would melt, so to speak. The wall would come down. Then you have guys like, we'll use DeAndre Jordan and Jamal Crawford, equally great guys as Blake and Chris, but their personalities are different. And DeAndre, I've known him since he was a teenager. And so anytime I see him, I can ask him anything and he'll tell me. I don't use a microphone because I think it sounds better when you tell the story and you can weave it in through certain things like free throws or 20-second timeouts. And Jamal is the same way, but I research these guys all year. And even in the off season, in August, I start kind of looking around and looking up stories of what may have happened. Obviously, I've seen DeAndre grow up in front of us since he was drafted. But with a guy like Jamal that played so many years before he joined, I feel like I unearth an Easter egg every couple of weeks when I kind of dig in on the story and I go and I talk to him about it. And I've learned that I think he was gambling with Michael Jordan one day and got into debt, and Jordan pulled him out of a club. And it was kind of crazy. Jamal Crawford is like Forrest Gump. He has lived the life. I don't mean it any other way other than the experiences he has had and the people that he has come across, knowingly, unknowingly. One of the great people that I've been around. But I think being present, to answer your question, I think being present in this situation, and you work for a school, you can do this, although their time is, it's only 4 years. But if you're there and they see that you care and that you're asking smart questions, I don't go to DeAndre and ask him about his free throws. You want to shut somebody down, bring up a negative. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I don't do that. So I just ask him, what did he work on in the summer? Tell me about, this player, you played with him. And sometimes that conversation will go on to, oh, yeah, I spent some time with him overseas. Oh, what'd you do overseas? Oh, I took a vacation with so-and-so. We went to Monaco, and, oh, man, I gambled. I never played blackjack before, or whatever. Those things come out. You get guys like Lee Jenkins, the greatest writer, I think, of our time for Sports Illustrated. People just want to tell him stuff because he's so good. I think for me, there's not going to be a flip that you can switch that all of a sudden these guys are going to start telling you their life story. For me, I've just been kind of the slow burn guy. I'm around. They know that I'm not going to ask them every single day a question, but when I do, I make it count. I agree. You got to be very time, savvy with it because you're not going to get more than 2 minutes of their undivided attention. So being around to me is the best advice I could give somebody. And they see that you understand what's going on and that you're not going to ask stupid questions. I think that's what it comes down to.
How do you keep track of, when you talk to guys and it's not recorded, is there do you have a system, will you go back and have a note card on a guy and all right, make sure I remember this as it was told to me so that if it comes up in my mind, I know I've got it 100% right a week from now?
That's exactly what I do. So the phone, I just put it in my notes. I literally will turn right around after we're done and they're going into the huddle or starting practice. I type it into the notes and I'll send it to myself so that I have it, not only on my phone, but now, quote unquote, in the cloud. And so it's on all my devices, and then I'll just take that and I'll transfer it into the board that I use for the Clippers. The one great thing about being a team broadcaster is that you'd always have to use you can always use that same board. It's digital for me now, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll just slide that in there under that player's name and number. I'll say, okay, and I don't have it in front of me, but like Luke Bahamute is a prince. His dad is a king in the community that he grew up in. And so I asked him about it. I'm like, does it sound like it sounds? And he's like, no, it's more like a city council. He's like, it's more like a city council seat than anything else. But there's definitely a nice vibe to it. And like I said, I don't have the numbers in front of me and stuff like that. But so I put it right in there and I keep it there. And so you want to make sure that you're 100% accurate. But I just, like I said, I find that the microphone is a built-in wall, and they're just going to be icy about any answer. We had a guy, although that said, we had a guy named Chris Kaman, who was one of my favorites to deal with. And I was with the Clippers from 07. Chris was with us from 07 to, well, he was traded in December of 11 with the Chris Paul deal. And so let's say I interviewed Chris 30 times. I'll bet you more than half of them I could not use on a microphone because of the things that he said. There's no filter for him. So there was either bad stories about players that he's playing with today. I'm like, Chris, I can't say that. I can't put that on the air. And then he'd swear back at me. And I mean, that's just who he is. Like, it's a fun thing. He was one of my favorites to deal with. But everybody other than Chris Kaman, I think a microphone just builds that wall, and it's hard to get over. And if you can get around it, and I understand sound bites, I get all that. The way around that is I'd ask him a few questions off mic, and then if you had to get a sound bite, then that's the last thing I'd do. But these guys are going to be more willing to chat without that microphone. And when you do get that conversation, write it down, put it in your notes, put it in your phone, do what you got to do to keep it, so to speak, in memory. And I think that's the best thing that I was ever told as kind of a younger play-by-play guy.
On that note, I saw in another interview you did too that you said you ask more of Doc off air than you do on air, and that your on-air questions you usually know the answer to ahead of time. What are the types of things you ask him off air, and how does that help mold your understanding of what you're looking at every night?
So sometimes I'll ask him about a certain play that's run, and I'm not trying to break down X's and O's. So one of the things, I'll give you a couple examples. One of the plays, it's a 3-man weave at the top of the key, and it's hard for me to describe it without sounding monotonous. So if you're familiar with the 3-man weave, basically that ball is touching 3 different players within 2 seconds. And so instead of me describing it and kind of getting bored myself because they ran it frequently, I asked him, I said, can you tell me about this play? What are you trying to achieve? And so he says, well, I want to have either Austin or Jamal have the ball, kind of a live ball where they can drive or they can kick it to somebody else. So when that play begins, hey, and the Clippers toss the ball around, 3-man weave, top of the key. Doc told me that this is what they're looking for. And then there's Austin Rivers, goes down the lane to the rim with the right hand. So I don't want to, those are kind of questions that I ask him. Sometimes I'll ask him about, hey, you played with this player. Do you have any good stories about him? He's, oh, yeah, I got a good one. Or I don't have a good one. And I'm like, well, I won't ask you about that. Or I will ask you. Like, he'll start to tell me the story. And I'm like, no. Just tell me on the air. And sometimes if there's a topic that might be sensitive, like for an example, a few years ago, we had a player, Glenn Davis, big baby. And Doc sent him into the locker room during a second quarter in a game in Houston. And it was newsworthy. I mean, it got on ESPN, and the next night we played. But before the game, I wanted to make sure. I said, look, this happened. Can I talk to you about it? Oh, yeah, no problem. I'm like, I'm going to ask you about it, what you do, how do you handle it, what's the post-mortem on it? Do you guys have a separate meeting? And, it turns out to be, to me, it's number one, it helps him understand, like, I'm not trying to dig for stuff that is inappropriate. I want him to know that if he doesn't want to talk about it, I'm not going to talk about it. But if there's something good, I'll let him, save it for the air. So those are the kind of things I ask him. We get, I'd say 10 minutes with Doc, and 4 of those minutes are on an interview, and then there's a TV interview that lasts a couple of minutes, and we're just kind of rapping for a little while just to figure out where I want to go with that interview. Because Doc is so great, you don't want to blow the opportunity. His answers are always thought out. There's always wisdom behind it. So I won't lie. There's been coaches in the past, both in the NBA, IBA, and CBA, where I'm like, this is just going to be like, a root canal. I'd rather have that than interview these guys. But Doc is the opposite. He's going to give you so much good stuff that you want to be prepared. So, instead of just kind of winging it, I've always got a topic here and there to talk about because it goes beyond basketball too. I mean, it's just been a lot of fun. So I want to make sure that I take advantage of that time with Doc and let him get some thoughts generated if we're going to talk about an off-topic thing, and kind of let him know, look, I'm going to ask you this question. This is all I'm trying to find out. You can tell me whatever you want to, with what you're comfortable with, but this is a topic that I'm going to ask you about, if that's all right with him.
I'm curious about the technical aspect of calling a game too, and I'm curious too when you talk about what you talked about with Doc there in terms of how you describe a different play differently or what they're trying to accomplish in what they're doing. How much do you try to get into the flow of action, or I guess what's your approach in terms of what you can say and when you can say it, how descriptive you can be, if you can talk about what a guy looks like or what a play looks like developing, or are you somebody that tries to be as simple as you can and then go back and describe things a little bit more in depth when you get a second afterward?
Everybody has their own style, and to me, there's no wrong one. Like I said, there's 30 NBA guys, present company excluded. I would tell you they're all awesome. I love listening to everybody. I go up and down the dial. I learn something from them every night. So with that said, I go solo. I go solo for every game I do. And a lot of people are like, oh man, that's really hard. And it can be. There are nights where you're taxed and the game is brutal and it's just been tough. Those happen maybe 3 times a year. The other games, I'm like, this is the way I would prefer to do it. So from a description standpoint, I guess we'll go back. It was in the mid-'90s, and I was starting out. I'd been working I was the assistant sports director for my high school radio station, and I did some games. And it was very, did you ever play an instrument when you were growing up? Did you ever learn how to?
Trumpet player, yeah.
Okay, so like one of the first things I'm guessing you learned was a very simple song. Like I played piano. So like Mary Had a Little Lamb. There's 4 notes. That's all it was. And so those 4 notes for me in basketball calling play-by-play was Johnson, over to Smith, back to Jones, up top to Johnson, over to Smith, back to Jones. I'm like, okay, so that's easy. I'm following the ball, but now you got to kind of jazz it up a little bit. So then you start to get, the location. Well, so I'd get left side, right side, up top, down low, left, down low, right. Well, I remember listening to the game, like, hey, you're following the ball. You got your brain trained. And I remember driving around listening to the NCAA tournament mid-'90s on the radio. And it's an innocuous play, but it literally blew my mind. The guy says, here's Smith, brings it across half court, right-handed, hip-high dribble. And I'm like, whoa, you can describe the height of the dribble. I bet you could describe a lot of different things. And so I went home like a mad scientist. And I drew a court, and I started thinking of all the elements that are involved: the ball, the players, the uniform, the length of the short. What is the coach doing? What are the fans doing? Where are the officials? And no question, early on in my quote unquote career, I overdid it. Like I was way too much. And I wanted to have a fancy phrase for every play of the game. And I've gone back home. I go back home every summer to Iowa with my family, and I stumbled across some tapes, and I remember like cringing, like, oh my God, what were you doing? But like at the same time, I'm like, I was flexing a quote unquote creative muscle, and I would rather ratchet it down than have to try to get somebody to invent one. So I was doing a bunch of descriptions. It was gaudy is the right word to use. So I've tapered it back a ton, but I want to describe as much as I can. Because I go solo, I don't have an analyst. There's no time for anybody to come in. It's just all me. So I'm describing literally everything I can within reason. I don't want to drown, and I don't want to kill the game. I don't want to bore the listeners. But if Doc Rivers is roaming the sidelines with his arms folded in front of his chest, well, I'm going to tell you that as Chris Paul dribbles the ball to the wing, whatever. I want you to see what I'm seeing, whether it's a visual motion, a snapshot, whatever. I do it in real time because, again, I don't have an analyst. I can do that, and I don't have to worry about stepping on anybody's toes. But as much as I can describe within reason, I want you to hear it. And I listen to every game I've ever done, and I take notes. I used to take physical notes. Now it's mental notes that I say, I want to make sure that I'm giving you 3-dimensional stuff. Like it isn't over to, into, back to, it's left side, right side, up top. And I take those mental notes and I make sure that I'm staying on course. There are times when your game is just awful. It happens when you do, roughly 100 games a year. You're not going to be pitch perfect, but it's not going to be from a lack of effort. So you're to go around the block, to go next door, I describe as much as I can. And there are days when I've said, that's just too much. Let's leave that one out. Not only is it too much, but it slows you down to get back to the play at hand, that kind of stuff. So I love description. I love reading descriptive writing and figuring out, can I use that word? Can I use that phrase? Does that help you see the picture more? And that's kind of where I come from. But it all started with a hip high dribble with a right hand, and it blew my mind.
This solo thing I was curious about too, so I'm glad you brought that up, because I do a couple of games solo a year, and they drive me nuts. Number one, because I hate the sound of my own voice for like that long a period of time, and I always feel like I'll pause, and then the dead air is just too long for like my liking, so they always drive me batty. But the other thing that drives me crazy with it is I never feel like I can see everything, if that makes sense. When I've got my partner with me, I'll lean on David to have seen how certain things developed away from the ball, and he's really good at jumping in and describing the play after the fact. How do you best see as much as possible while you still have the responsibilities of, ball, player, location, time, and score?
That's a great question. I've never tried to be an analyst. I'll tell you my opinion, or I'll tell you maybe a strategic move, like, they're bringing DeAndre out because they're at the 4 foul mark with 3 minutes to play. They'll bring him back into the 2-minute mark. That's about as deep of an analyst role as I'll ever play. I'm not going to tell you how the play developed. You do television though, right?
TV and radio.
TV and radio, okay. Because my point was on TV, the fan can see what's going on. You wouldn't necessarily need to say how it broke up. But I don't try to be an analyst. Even if I did know the game at that level, which I don't because I didn't play it at that level, you don't carry credibility. So my role is tell you what I see, and then in the aftermath, I'll bring up, Chris Paul used a great ball fake, and that's what freed him up inside. Obviously, that's elementary. You can see that yourself, but I never try to be an analyst. It just isn't going to work. So I watch the ball, and after the ball is shot, sometimes I watch what's going on underneath to see if there's the rebound. Sometimes I watch around the perimeter. It varies. And one of the things about being with the team, certainly for as long as I've been, I kind of have an idea of what's happening. Like I have an idea of what is to come. And I don't mean that from a coaching standpoint. Like I just understand, what this play is about. I've seen it 100 times already, and we're not even to Thanksgiving. I know where Chris is going to be after he passes this ball. And that's not because I study the playbook. It isn't because I'm asking players what, slice 5 means, which is a play code for them. It's just because I've seen it. And the more you see it, the more you understand what's happening. But again, I don't go into the X's and O's as to why it happened, how it happened, and what they should do next. Because even if I did know that, it's just not, I don't carry the credibility, and nor should I. I'm not looking to carry that kind of credibility with the fans.
One more thing I wanted to get to you with also is, I guess, kind of a buzz topic in broadcast circles nowadays too in the NBA, and I know it's a pet peeve of Mark Boyle over here in Indiana too. But location of broadcasters in arenas nowadays. What's it like for you broadcasting on the radio in sometimes really good locations and sometimes less than ideal locations, particularly when you're alone and your eyes are the only eyes?
So Mark, first of all, is awesome. I don't know if you've had him on your podcast yet or not, but he is.
I've not had the chance yet, yeah.
Oh, he is. I highly recommend it. Very wise man, and a great listen, and the fans in Indiana are very lucky. He has a right to gripe because I think he started with the Pacers, I want to say in 1989. And from 1989 for Mark all the way to 2006, they were given front row seats every game. This isn't being spoiled. I know it sounds that way. It is not. And so for Mark to become accustomed for, 18 years, 16 years, 17 years to sit in that spot, to be as descriptive as possible, and then to be moved back, sometimes in locations where you literally can't see a third of the court. They have a right to gripe because that's how they were brought up in terms of the seat, the view, and the ability to call the game at the highest level. I came in the year as a full-time announcer in 2006. That was the first year the NBA said you can get those first row seats to the working media, and we'll move your local radio guys back. Now, look, if you would have told minor league Brian that, hey, you're going to call NBA games, but sometimes you're going to have a seat that isn't great and you're going to be 25 rows back at times, would you still want the job? Obviously. So I've literally never have complained about the location, but that's because in theory, that's all I know. But there's a lot of veterans there that's what they're used to. And the one gripe that I guess I would understand for sure with them, aside from that's what they're used to, was they were giving those seats to beat writers. And I love the beat writers do a great job in the NBA, and my info wouldn't be complete without reading them. So this is not an indictment on them, but they're giving a history report. You know what I mean? Like they're writing after the game. We're giving you a real-time update. And I think that's where a lot of the guys got sideways with the decision. But like I said, I came in, that's all I know. I've never complained about it. And until they tell me that I can't come to the arena to call the game, I'll be just fine. I think we'll be okay. But I highly recommend you chat with Mark Boyle. He is one of the best in the league. Indiana's lucky to have him, and he'd be a good insight to a lot of these questions that you've asked here.
Brian, I appreciate you giving me the time today too. This is awesome, and I want to let you get back to being Dr. Dad today. So, is there a way that I guess people can follow you on social media or hear Brian Sieman best?
Yeah, and I have. This is now third year in a row where I've vowed to be more active on Twitter. I think it's a great medium. I'm on there all the time. Like it is my main source of info, but I want to be an info provider. So I've made a conscious effort this summer to figure out what my voice on Twitter will be, and come next season, I will have more of a presence there. But it's at @bsieman, BSIEMAN, and the best way to hear myself or any of the great NBA play-by-play guys is through the NBA app. I think it's $9, and you can hear all the audio from all across the NBA. If you're an aspiring play-by-play guy, whether you want to do football, baseball, whatever, you will learn something from all of those people in the NBA. It's never been better, I think, in NBA radio, and that's the best way to do it, the NBA app. So I will see you there.
That's Brian Sieman, the voice of the Los Angeles Clippers, here on Play-by-Playcast, episode number 53 in the books. One thing that really stuck with me, too, by the way, let me go all the way back to the beginning. If you remember, he talked about getting involved in every aspect he could possibly get his hands on. And then what that meant to him with the Clippers, that kind of hit home with me a little bit. From the standpoint of, he's only getting paid to do the games. But he still wants to, not only wants to, but leaps at the opportunity, and he used the word honored, is honored at the opportunity when he's asked by the sales team to, do a mock-up of an ad. Not an actual ad, like a mock-up of an ad that they could eventually sell to somebody that would then become a real one. Or to get involved in the community relations team and all that stuff is just kind of bonus stuff. Just be around the team, be part of that family. That resonates, I think, with me in particular a lot, just in terms of always wanting to be involved. And I don't mean that in a nosy way, in a bad way, but just wanting to be part of that culture and family. It struck me. I love the approach, and I love the pride that Brian takes in that as well. So I just wanted to point that out real quick as we wrap up here on episode number 53. Take a 7-day break. We will be back at it next week, and we're actually going to gravitate away from basketball for a week. We'll get back to it coming up here, but we've had a couple NBA guys back-to-back. We're going to go to the NFL. Football season, this is going to be really crazy to say, but legitimately kind of sort of around the corner. And next week's guest actually is starting to kind of get into his hot season, so I'm glad we had a chance to catch up with Tennessee Titans voice Mike Keith prior to the NFL season and the NFL preseason really starting to get churning here over the next couple of months. Tennessee Titans voice Mike Keith will be our guest next week on the podcast. it'll be episode number 54. And it'll be right back here if you click download or subscribe. Anyway, music's playing, which means we got to get up on out of here. So many thanks again to Brian Sieman for being our guest this week on the podcast. Many thanks, as always, to you for clicking subscribe or download. And we'll talk to you next week with Tennessee Titans voice Mike Keith here on Play-by-Playcast. Hit it, Marshmallow.